Welcome not only to another new year, but also to another new edition of the ARE webinar series. I'm happy to see so many of you joining today. ARE stands for Artistic Research Education. More specifically, the overarching theme is how can students and teachers, supervisors be empowered to engage with artistic research at higher music education institutions. My name is Stefan Gies. As the long-standing executive director of the AEC, I was involved in developing and implementing this project from the beginning. And in fact, it all started as a follow-up of two successful Erasmus projects on learning and teaching artistic research at higher music education institutions. REACT was the one project and RepLab the other one. The future perspective is to become part of the AEC-run European Platform for Artistic Research in Music, EPAM, but also connecting to activities and projects such as the research catalog of the Society for Artistic Research, SAR, and the project IartNET, which is an international platform for artistic practice and research at Italian higher arts education institutions. The ARE webinars started last year, and we had two webinars so far. After the first webinar was more of a general introduction to the topic, we then addressed chosen aspects or subtopics. Today's subtopic is artistic research in cross and transdisciplinary settings. And it is my great pleasure to welcome two colleagues from the University of Aveiro in northern Portugal, who have a very particular expertise and outstanding experience in dealing with the issue, Gilvano Dalagna and Jorge Salgado Correia. Now, Gilvano and Jorge, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Stefan, for this lovely introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Gilvano. I come from Portugal, from University of Aveiro and INET-md. And together with my colleague Jorge, we will be facilitating this webinar, Teaching Artistic Research in Cross and Transdisciplinary Settings. So, the seminar moves between theory, practice, and pedagogy. It begins with a brief conceptual framing of artistic research and transdisciplinarity, followed by 3 doctoral projects from a doctoral program in artistic creation that show how these ideas emerge through practice. These examples lead into a short breakout discussion and plenary exchange. In the second part, we turn to conservatoire education, introducing specific supervisory strategy and examples of its application in this context. We conclude by reflecting on challenges, future research, and long-term learning perspectives. So many artistic research projects nowadays are developed in music conservatoires and no longer remain confined to a single artistic discipline. They frequently engage with other artistic fields such as theater, literature, movement, visual media, or other performative practices. This raises important pedagogical questions for those of us who teach, supervise, and assess artistic research. In this webinar, we use the term transdisciplinarity in a very specific way. We are not referring to collaborations between the arts and the sciences, but rather to artistic research processes that unfold across artistic disciplines, where different artistic expressions and modes of making come into dialogue. So transdisciplinarity, as articulated by Basharab Nicolescu, constitutes a response to the limits of strictly disciplinary thinking in the face of complex contemporary realities. Rather than being just collaboration between disciplines, it's an epistemological stance in which knowledge is understood as embodied, experiential, relational, and process-based, especially relevant in artistic research. Nicolescu defines transdisciplinarity as that which operates between, across, and beyond disciplines, grounded in 3 key pillars: multiple levels of reality, the logic of the included middle, and complexity. The logic of the included middle rejects binary oppositions such as theory-practice or subject-object and instead allows for the productive coexistence of apparent contradictions. In artistic research, this is visible in the way practice and reflection process and result, knowing and not knowing, interdependently generate meaning in between spaces. At the same time, complexity is embraced rather than simplified. Uncertainty, emergence, and openness are treated as constitutive of inquiry, not as methodological failures. This stance is particularly important in higher arts education, where linear research models struggle to account for iterative and transformative artistic processes. This conception also helps distinguish transdisciplinarity from multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. In multidisciplinarity, disciplines work side by side on a shared topic. In interdisciplinarity, there is some methodological exchange, but disciplinary borders remain largely intact. Transdisciplinarity, by contrast, lets inquiry unfold across and beyond disciplines so that the resulting knowledge cannot be attributed to any single field and is oriented to understanding the world itself. In artistic research, particularly in higher music education, this provides a philosophical grounding for non-linear, practice-based, and embodied forms of knowledge, and it underpins pedagogical models where teachers act less as a sole disciplinary authorities and more as facilitators and co-researchers within multi-artistic reflexive learning environments. Adopting transdisciplinarity in the sense here proposed does not imply abandoning disciplinary rigor. Rather, it calls for a reframing of rigor in relation to coherence, complexity, and ethical responsibility across different levels of artistic practice. So now, Jorge, the word is with you.
At this point, we would like to present our experiences about at both epistemological and pedagogical levels, working at the doctoral program in artistic creation, PDCA, which is a doctoral program offered by the University of Aveiro in Portugal in association with two polytechnic institutes from Leiria and Porto. This association represented an essential reinforcement, especially in terms of mobilizing human resources to cover all artistic areas, but also in terms of an exponential increase in logistical capacity with the sharing of property-equipped laboratories, studios, and performance halls. The PDCA promotes a transdisciplinary strategy for the development of creative experimental thinking, welcoming candidates with an interest in creative practices, namely in the areas of fine arts, painting, sculpture, ceramics, engraving, sound arts, sound installation, sound sculptures, visual arts, photographies, cinema, video, animation, digital art, literature, dance, theater, and music. All planning, presentation of specific content, and supervision of doctoral students is carried out as a team to foster transdisciplinary perspectives. A central premise of the program is that the doctoral thesis takes the form of an artistic creation project. In accordance with the legal framework for doctoral studies in the arts, we have this modality. Rather than conceiving artistic practice as an appendix to theoretical research, the PDCA understands artistic research as a poetic process in which hands-on creation and meaning-making are inseparable. Knowledge is not produced through linear argumentation or generalization, but through embodied, situated, and relational processes. Artistic research is thus evaluated not as a collection of isolated works, but as a corpus of works, an evolving constellation of artistic outputs connecting by underlying concerns, ways of working, and symbolic trajectories. This corpus of works is understood as an open and dynamic system through which artistic thought, ethical positioning, and intervention in the world becomes visible. When we speak of artistic intervention in the context of artistic research, we are not referring to representation, illustration, or commentary on the world. Rather, we understand intervention as a way of acting within reality through artistic practice, creating situations that reconfigure perception, relations, and possibilities for meaning. Artistic research from this perspective does not seek primarily to describe the world, but to intervene in it by opening new ways of seeing, listening, feeling, and imagining. Such intervention is always situated at relational, and it unfolds in concrete contexts, social, cultural, ecological, constitutional, and emerges through encounters between bodies, materials, environments, performers, and audiences. What matters is not the scale or visibility of the intervention, but its capacity to generate shifts in attention, experience, and understanding. These shifts may be subtle, temporary, or speculative, yet they are central to how artistic research produces knowledge through action and experience. This conception of intervention also helps explain why transdisciplinarity emerges so strongly in artistic research. When artistic practice intervenes in complex realities, it often encounters the limits of any single disciplinary framework. Dialogue with other artistic practices or forms of knowledge becomes necessary, not by design, but because the work itself demands it. In pedagogical terms, this shifts learning towards responsibility and reflection, inviting students to consider not only what they make, but what their making does in the world. From this perspective, artistic research within the PDCA does not seek to describe the world, but to intervene in it, as has been said. Knowledge emerges through artistic action and through the effects such action produces, what it makes visible, what it unsettles, and what it enables participants to experience and imagine differently. Pedagogically, this approach is introduced from the first semester through short, weekly artistic interventions developed by students, preferably starting from their own artistic expertise. These interventions are discussed collectively with attention given not only to their outputs, but also to their outcomes, affects, lived experience, subjectivity, and transformation. Through these embodied and practice-based processes, students gradually learn to articulate the core dimensions of an artistic research project, culminating in the defense of a proposal at the end of the first year. This doctoral program in artistic research was created in 2022, is now in the 4th edition, and is a transdisciplinary third cycle program that aims to bring together professionals from different artistic fields. What units our doctoral students is the fact that they are already established artists in their respective fields, seeking to develop their artistic practice in an academic context, and in this way relaunch their careers. The main objective of this cycle of studies is not to offer artistic training, but rather to equip students with the necessary skills for artistic research. In other words, in our view, mere artistic training is not in itself academically sufficient. There must also be an ethical commitment to critically examine and challenge existing structures in order to reconfigure pre-established perceptions of reality. This doctoral program is structured around a curricular model that integrates artistic practice, research methodologies, and project development across 3 years. The first year is primarily dedicated to establishing a shared epistemological and methodological ground through curricular units that introduce artistic research frameworks, transdisciplinary thinking, and exploratory practice, while supporting students in articulating the initial contours of their individual projects. This phase culminates in the defense of an artistic research proposal. The second and third years are fully devoted to the development of the doctoral project under close supervision, allowing artistic practice, research, and reflection to unfold in an integrated and interactive manner. This structure reflects the program's understanding of the thesis as an artistic creation project in which learning is processual, situated, and responsive to the evolving needs of each artist researcher. The study regulations of the University of Aveiro provides for an alternative modality in the artistic field for the presentation of theses. The thesis may be replaced, the traditional long thesis, the traditional model, can be replaced by, in the field of the arts, by a work or set of works or achievements of an innovative nature, accompanied by a written clarification that explains the process of conception and elaboration, the capacity for research, and its place in the evolution of knowledge in the field in which it is inserted. This alternative modality involves a set of distinctive characteristics in relation to other established epistemological practices. It should be understood as a poetic process of artistic creation and its symbolic implications. Poetic, since it is about hands-on processes, and poetic, since it is about not so much how things are, but how they affect us. The episteme links the poetic devices of creation to a plurality of writings that overcome the dichotomies of disciplinary and logocentric thinking that divide theory and practice, event and document, subject and object, among others. Differs from art studies, which are based on an epistemology of research plus creation, which is a hybrid modality established in recent academic history to give artists a place in the academic production. It's also promoting a constant reconfiguration of ways of working through which artistic thought, a unique poetic universe, and interpretation, taking a stance and acting in the world, become visible as a corpus of works that would be evaluated for its ability to share knowledge through empathy, not aiming to impersonal conceptual coherence. It seeks to generate specific contributions to the field of art, to the construction of meaning, and to the production of new knowledge through creation in art and the configuration of the corpus of works. A corpus of works, rather than a simply collection of works, refers here to a body of artistic outputs that are connected by underlying ideas, questions, or ways of working, even when these connections are not immediately visible or consciously planned. Each work gains meaning in relation to the others, forming an ongoing artistic trajectory rather than a set of isolated results. This perspective shifts attention away from individual finished works and towards the artistic process as a whole. It invites us to rethink authorship and the role of the artist as something that develops over time through practice and reflection. It also highlights the close relationship between poiesis making and poetics meaning making, suggesting that artistic meaning often emerges through the accumulation of work rather than being fully defined in advance. Finally, a corpus of works is an entity in constant motion and reinvention. It is an open system of dispositions and interactions with an environment that constitutes a poetic, aesthetic, and political ecology. A corpus of works is a work in itself and also a matrix of creation, therefore of updating new productions and source of seeds for the future. Artistic creation produces knowledge through particular, embodied, and situated experiences. Its value lies in articulating singular configurations of perception and meaning that emerge in specific contexts. This particularity legitimizes artistic knowledge as a unique contribution to human understanding, grounded in experience and irreducible to general models. The organization of artistic knowledge is therefore based on the following 4 principles. Processuality, knowledge is generated throughout the creative process, not just as a final result. Reflexivity, practice is accompanied by critical listening, which allows us to understand the artist's aesthetic and ethical choices. Contextuality, the meaning of the work depends on its social, cultural, and symbolic roots. Symbolic coherence, the formal and expressive elements of creation are articulated in such a way as to generate affective and conceptual resonance. And finally, singularity. Each process and each work constitutes a unique epistemic proposition. Australian researcher and artist Barbara Bolt is perhaps here helpful. She distinguishes between artwork and work of art in a way that helps us to think of art simultaneously as resistance and as intervention. Artwork, in her view, is the concrete product, a performance, an installation, a film, a poem, an event, while work of art is the work that art does, the displacement of concepts, sensibilities, methodologies, and material practices that emerges from the artistic process. From this perspective, art as a resistance is not only the critical content of a piece, but the way in which it destabilizes established forms of meaning and experience. Intervention occurs when, from within these mythopoetic configurations, the work produces deviations. It creates fissures in dominant discourses, exposes exclusions, and invents new symbolic constellations. By rejecting subordination to logocentric models and proposing a plural, sensitive, and situated epistemology, we believe that artistic research may contribute to a more inclusive, complex, and humanized ecology of knowledge. In sum, art reconfigures a territory to which science has no access, the world of subjectivities, and that which underpins and connects them, intersubjectivity. To investigate the intersubjectivity dimension from which individual subjectivities emerge, students are invited during the first semester to develop short artistic interventions on a weekly basis using any medium, but preferably starting from their own artistic expertise. These interventions are then discussed collectively by students and tutors with the focus placed on not on an abstract theoretical brainstorming, but on a close examination of its creator's subjectivity, lived experience, affects, and emotion thesis, as well as on both the outputs of the interventions, what is produced, and their outcomes, what they trigger or transform in those involved. Through these body storming sessions, the course seeks to foster forms of material thinking in which reflection arises from embodied artistic practice and from the concrete processes and effects of making. At the same time, Through their artistic interventions and in this very practical and committed manner, students learn about each of the dimensions of an artistic research proposal. At the end of the first year, as it was said, they must defend an artistic research project before a jury that includes external assessors. After the proposals are approved, they officially register the project title and the respective supervisory team. So, Gilvano.
Thanks, Jorge. So, building on the framework outlined earlier, where artistic research is understood not as a mode of representation, but as a form of intervention that generates new ways of seeing, sensing, and imaging, this section presents three concrete doctoral projects developed within the PDCA. Rather than functioning as illustrative case studies, these projects are introduced as situated, articulations of artistic inquiry, each demonstrating how knowledge emerges through practice, relation, and transformation of contexts. Taken together, the three projects foreground artistic research as a processual, relation, and open-ended endeavor, in which questions evolve through engagement with specific contexts, materials, and communities. They exemplify how artistic research unfolds as a corpus of work rather than a collection of discrete outputs, and how documentation, experimentation, and reflection operate as constitutive dimensions of the research processes. The projects will be presented in order that moves from a planetary and climatic imaginaries through ecological and more than human relations to embodied and performative musical practice. This progression does not imply a hierarchy of scale or importance, but rather highlights different ways in which transdisciplinary artistic research can intervene across contexts, territorial, ecological, and performative, while remaining grounded in situated practice. So the first example is particularly significant as it corresponds to the first doctoral thesis to be defended within the PDCA and offers a paradigmatic illustration of artistic research as a process of intervention, as we discussed it so far, whose consequences exceeds its initial scope. The project began as a practice-based investigation into climate change, memory, and disappearing landscapes, grounded in long-term artistic work developed in the South Flats of Aveiro. Initially framed as Rising Water Rising, the research proposed a performative methodology rooted in situated experience, embodied memory, and co-creation with local communities engaging with everyday narratives of loss, transformation, and belonging in territories affected by rising sea levels. Drawing on post-human and phenomenological perspectives, particularly the notion of bodies of water, the project treated climate change not as an abstract phenomenon, but as something lived, sensed, and remembered through bodies, gestures, and collective practices. From this local and experiential grounding, the research progressively expanded towards a broader planetary horizon. Tuvalu, for those who eventually don't know, Tuvalu is supposed to be the first country that will disappear because of the climate change. This country initially entered the project as a speculative and symbolic reference, a distant mirror through which the fragility of coastal territories could be reimagined. However, as the artistic work gained visibility, this speculative dimension was unexpectedly transformed into a concrete relational trajectory. The project attracted the attention of the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, who traveled to the University of Aveiro to visit the first exposition that this student organized, and invited the doctoral researcher to visit the country. This encounter marked a decisive turning point in the research. What had begun as an artistic inquiry into vanishing landscapes evolved into a direct engagement with political, cultural, and institutional realities. Through dialogue and collaboration between this student in the Ministry of Tuvalu, the project contributed to the conception of the Tuvalu Contemporary Art Museum, whose curatorial and artistic direction was entrusted to the doctoral researcher. In this context, artistic research did not operate as a representation or commentary, but as a catalyst for institutional imagination, enabling the emergence of new cultural infrastructures within a context of extreme environmental vulnerability. The relational dynamics of the project continue to unfold across contexts. As I said, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu later visited the University of Aveiro to attend the exhibition derived for the doctoral research, and this symbolic reversing the initial movement from center to periphery and reinforcing the reciprocity embedded in the project. More recently, the research has entered in a further speculative and planetary dimension. Some of its final artistic works, developed by this student, are scheduled to be presented within a contemporary art exposition to be established on the Moon, extending the project beyond terrestrial geography and situating climate memory within a cosmic and post-territorial horizon. Transdisciplinarity in this project is not articulated as the convergence of disciplines, but as a trajectory of entanglements across artistic practice, environmental thought, community-based knowledge, political futures. The research moves fluidly between local landscapes and planetary imageries, between embodied performance and policy-level implications, between documentation and world-making. Throughout the doctoral processes, documentation through logo books, audiovisual recordings, and interactive reflective coding played a crucial role in tracing these transformations, not as linear outcomes, but as emergent effects of sustained artistic engagement. The resulting corpus of work encompasses performances, installations, exhibitions, publications, institutional initiatives, and speculative extensions, forming a constellation that cannot be reduced to a single medium, site, or disciplinary frame. As the first thesis defended within the PDCA, this project exemplifies how artistic research does not seek to describe the world from a distance, but to intervene in it, generating new relations, new institutions, and new imaginaries, sometimes in places where art was not previously expected to operate. The second example foregrounds artistic research as an intervention into ecological perception, departing from the premise that environmental awareness cannot be sustained through information alone. Instead, it proposes that artistic practice can reconfigure how humans perceive and relate to non-human life by creating situated, sensory, and relational experiences. The project develops a phytopoetic practice in which plants are approached not as metaphors or scenographic elements, but as active participants within the artistic process. Through live encounters involving performers, plants, and audience, the work unsettles anthropocentric habits of listening and seeing, inviting participants to experience vegetal life as responsive and communicative. Transdisciplinarity here does not take the form of a synthesis of disciplines, but emerges from the necessity of the inquiry itself. The artistic questions posed cannot be meaningfully addressed within a single epistemic framework. Technology functions as a relational mediator, enabling improvised interaction through the sonification of plant bioelectric activity. Documentation supports reflective cycles throughout the process, and the resulting outcomes form a corpus of work, a constellation of performance, sonic materials, and relational situations that evolves over time. Artistic research, articulated here as a form of ecological inquiry that intervenes by transforming perception and relation, proposing alternative ways of being with plants, technology, and one another. The third example draws on an artistic research project developed within the field of popular music, which proposes a critical inversion of dominant expectations surrounding contemporary performance. Rather than intensifying technological apparatus or visual spectacular effects, crescer para dentro, growing to inside, approaches multimodality as a practice of listening, presence, and relational engagement oriented towards an intimate and situate artistic experience. The research unfolds from the artist's own practice as a singer-songwriter, treating songs not as finished works but as living material, open to deconstruction and reconfiguration across different sensory regimes. Multimodality, here, is understood not as the accumulation of media, but as a relational process in which gesture, movement, drawing, voice, image, space, and audience interaction continuously inform one another. Transdisciplinarity emerges not through the combination of these disciplines, but through work in the interstices between artistic, corporeal, visual, and performative modes of knowing. The project follows an inverse creative trajectory, dismantling songs into rhythmic, melodic, and poetic layers that give rise to movement scores and graphic forms, which in turn reconfigure the concert as a dynamic organism. Documentation plays a formative role throughout the process, supporting reflective cycles and giving rise to a corpus of work, a relational field of songs, performances, gestures, drawings, and processual traces that unfolds non-linearly. Artistic research is articulated here as a mode of intervention that transforms the artist's practice, the act of listening, and the relationship between the performer and the audience. So taken together, these three projects show transdisciplinarity not as the combination of disciplines, as Basharab Nicolescu proposed in the beginning, but as something that emerges when artistic questions become too complex to be addressed from a single perspective. In all three cases, artists move across practices, contexts, and forms of knowledge because the work itself demands it, operating in spaces in between bodies and environments, human and more than human agents, local situations, and wider imaginaries. What connects these projects is not a shared method, but a shared commitment to relational, situated, and transformative practice. In fact, coexistent and lived experience of transdisciplinarity would be crucial from the earliest stages of training in art schools, especially in conservatoires, in order to prepare students to face the challenges of their lifelong artistic journey and to engage with other disciplines if the challenges require. From this perspective, for us, the question is no longer whether such approaches have a place in conservatoires, but rather when we can begin to cultivate forms of research, reflection, and relational practice that prepare students to navigate the professional world. Historically, conservatory education has privileged technical mastery and repertoire transmission, yet research in music education shows that meaningful learning requires reflective and inquiry-driven pedagogies. At the same time, contemporary musical careers increasingly demand adaptability, collaboration, and the ability to work across contexts, rather than linear performance-only trajectories. From this perspective, transdisciplinary research-informed practice offers a way to embed inquiry within artistic learning itself, helping students understand music as a relational, social, and processual practice, while developed at doctoral level. Our experience within the PDCA shows that these principles need to be cultivated at early stages of conservatory education, as we said, where they can be translated into age-appropriate strategies that support the formation of musicians who are not only technical proficient, but also critically aware and prepared to navigate uncertainty in contemporary artistic life. For many music educators, especially those working nowadays in conservatoires, this situation can be both stimulating and sometimes, why not, discouraging. How do we guide students when their research drowns on artistic practices outside our own expertise? How do we support embodied, performative, or narrative textual forms of knowing while maintaining academic rigor? And how well do our existing frameworks for supervision and assessment respond to artistic work that resists clear disciplinary boundaries?
Okay, so maybe the moderators of each group can expose what were the issues the group has raised, and anyone can then complete with some commentary. I can start. In my group, raised the question of the awareness, or well, and also the critically exposing the Eurocentric perspective in music teaching, where the Western is central, and also the way we look to music from other cultures is also very conditioned by our Eurocentric view. And so there was this kind of a suggestion that the music teaching should be more open to world music, to decolonialization. Another point was the ethical issues, the importance of making the students think about why and for whom and in which manner are they doing their activities. Mainly were these points. And also, as an example of the Eurocentric perspective, for instance, they gave also the example of gender issues that are also involved in the Eurocentric perspective. And this was mainly what we got from our group.
Maybe I can say something. We were just starting this conversation, Jorge, because we are introducing ourselves in the discussion and talking about how things changed across generations. If in the past the music training seemed to be enough for many people, nowadays the reality is changing a lot and is requiring different capacities, not only from student but also from the supervisor, to face this more fragmented and at the same time expanded scope of interests. So what I wanted to add, and then we came back, was a little bit about our experience with the supervision in the last years. Because when we started with this doctoral program in artistic creation, we had some experience supervising projects like the previous ones we mentioned in the music doctoral program. Initially, we thought that the best solution was to create like a joint group of supervisors, each one from different areas, to guide that project. That seems to be more reasonable. But it started quite early. It was in the quite early that we realized that this was not, I mean, could be not enough, because it was common in some projects that each area tried to push the project for their own interests. And in the middle of all these discussions and tensions was the student and his or her project. So I think connecting with the questions that we're discussing in the breakout group, one of the things we realized in our practice is that the supervisor in this kind of context in transdisciplinary projects is not perhaps the person with a great stock of knowledge, but with a great perspective to create bridges between the different areas and to create a common dialogue, negotiating expectations from different sides. Because even when we are driven by transdisciplinarity, it's quite common that our thinking and our practice become multidisciplinary. And sometimes these do not correspond to the expectations that students has. This is just a little bit of the impressions I would like to share, and I just join what the comments I made in the beginning. So thank you. Maybe we can move to another group.
Shall I come in, perhaps?
Yeah, please, David.
No, two things I would highlight from our discussion were the significance of context and very practical matters like institutional specialisms, how different specialisms are thrown together or not in different small institutions. Things like supervisory arrangements, how they are managed. Even things like modes of study. For example, part-time study, allowing some more space for transdisciplinary projects to grow in a natural way as opposed to being forced through a particular timeline. And we had some reflections also, I think, on the significance of history, I guess the long history of institutions, again, the kind of gathering of different disciplines in different places, but actually the personal history of the students, and this reflects other comments that have been made, the ability of beginning doctoral students to be able to imagine different paths, and therefore the impact of their experience in the first and second cycles on their ability to conceive of the kind of transdisciplinary research that we're discussing today.
Maybe we moved to another group now?
We were also a little but very nice group with me. And we discussed maybe two things coming from the supervisor's side, the challenge sometimes in the changing perspective to this transdisciplinarity, to this more open form, to this more project-based way of thinking research, that also calls for space for supervisors to develop and have the dialogue with colleagues and so on. And from the student side, the importance of keeping the open mind, even if the project loses speed, and so you don't fall back into your own area of expertise, but keep you on the level of the transdisciplinarity and try and learn to see the options and possibilities that are there, and instead of the opposite. I think that was the two key messages in our discussions.
So I just saying that if you could have other perspectives from other groups, it would be lovely. So anyone else?
I can share some insights from our beautiful group. I spent in a group with two doctoral students, one from Poland and one from Italy, but both studying in Roma, which is nice. So we were discussing about them, what they are doing in their doctoral thesis. And they both agreed that it's very important to find similarities in topics in researches from other fields. Probably musicians also take insights from articles from medicine and technology field to look for inspiration in other topics, and maybe it's very important to use the competencies from other fields. So we also talk about researchers, how to share their aspect in the new way of thinking and to be inspired from others.
So maybe we can move to the next part. So,
in response to the challenges we have been discussing, namely the need to support transdisciplinary artistic research while remaining grounded in practice, we developed a strategy within the PDCA, the doctoral program we have been speaking, specifically designed for artists who arrived with strong professional identities but limited familiarity with research and research methodologies. Rather than imposing external research models, this strategy was conceived to grow from artistic practice itself, offering a shared language through which students and supervisors can articulate, question, and develop artistic research projects in a coherent and ethically grounded way. We refer to this strategy as IPAMOP, it's just the acronym, that reflects 6 interrelated dimensions considered essential to the development of an artistic research project: issue, problematic, action, method, output, and pertinence. Crucially, these dimensions are not understood as a linear sequence, but as a relational framework that allows projects to be revisited, reoriented, and deepened over time. The aim is not to standardize artistic research, but to create pedagogical conditions for clarity, focus, and critical reflection, particularly within transdisciplinary contexts. The first dimension, issue, has precisely to do with these ethical choices or worries or decisions, ethical decisions that the students should make when starting a project. This issue concerns the personal concerns, tensions, or urgencies that artists bring from their own practice or lived experience. Artists research, so just make a comment here, it's very different from the situation where the doctoral student goes in a project from a researcher that is already going on and is somehow trying to find something to do in that project, or to look for inspiration, as one of the colleagues was saying, here and there. The idea, because it is art and should be a personal view, it is about the personal view and the way personally someone is affected by the experiences, the lived experiences. We start by digging in the life experience and in the artist concerns. So artistic research does not begin with abstract research questions, but with an attentiveness to how artists are affected by the world, asking, what are your concerns? What are your unconformities? At the outset of the process, shifts the focus from intention to reflection, from knowing what one wants to do to understanding why it matters. And here it is where the ethical decisions come in. This requires careful listening on the part of supervisors and often represents a moment of epistemic repositioning for the candidates themselves. The second dimension, problematic, situates these concerns within a broader artistic and academic landscape. This is not a matter of compiling references, but of identifying an artistic gap, understanding how existing practices and discourses related to the issue and where the issue positions itself in relation to them. The problematic articulates the project's relevance with a shared field of knowledge while preserving its specificity. Action refers to the strategic response to this gap. It involves defining a clear field of action, which is being explored, and establishing objectives that articulate what the project aims to achieve. A key distinction is made here between proposals, which describe intentions, and objectives, which clarify anticipated transformations or outcomes. The method dimension addresses how the action is carried out. In the context of artistic research, methods are not primarily designed to extract data from theoretical generalization, but to document and support the emergence of new practices. Documentation, through logbooks, audiovisual records, and reflective coding, functions as a tool for thinking with the process rather than merely recording it. Output concerns the artistic forms through which the research materializes. These may include performances, installations, scores, films, publication, or hybrid formats, often involving collaborative or participatory processes. Outputs are understood not as a final proofs, but as situated manifestations of inquiry, inseparable from the process that generated them. Finally, pertinence addresses the potential social, cultural, ecological, or ethical implications of the project. Unlike objectives, which are the responsibility of the researcher, pertinence refers to effects that emerge through encounter, how the work may resonate, provoke, or transform relations with audiences or communities. This dimension foregrounds responsibility without instrumentalizing artistic practice. This IPAMOP strategy is applied across all curricular unities of PDCA and introduced through practical artistic exercise that allow students to engage with the framework through doing rather than abstracting. Conceived as both a supervisory tool and a pedagogical bridge, it supports the articulation between artistic practice and research while centering the process of the artist's own concerns and urgencies. Dialogue with other artistic fields and areas of knowledge emerge in response to the needs of each project, rather than as a disciplinary requirement, allowing transdisciplinarity to function as a consequence of artist inquiry. In this way, IPAMOP structures artistic research without reducing its openness, complexity, or transformative potential.
So thank you, Jorge. Just want to add two things related to this strategy. The first one is that it was created because a necessity we had when we started teaching artistic research to this kind of audiences. I mean, students with transdisciplinary interests. We realized that we had to create like a focus on what components were important to have in a strong artistic research proposal, because sometimes it was difficult to understand what are these components that make that are necessary to be present in artistic research proposal, and also that in our experience we don't introduce this to students explaining each of these components in particular. What we do is to create practical exercises that require a kind of exploration, and then after that we try to identify these elements in this exploratory practice. It's important also to mention that, as Jorge said, the idea is not to move across these dimensions in a linear way. They are more interrelated, so sometimes it's clear for the student what is the output they want to create, but it's not clear the methodologies to reach that. So the strategy also helps us to understand what are the gaps in the research proposal that need to be more developed. And by the way, when we mention action here, this was a necessity we also identified in our practice, because it was common that students came to us just with the idea that they want to play a recital or they want to do an installation, but it was not clear how the research was articulated with that output. So action in this sense, in this IPAMOP, is more to focus the attention in an exploratory field than a particular output. So now we just want to...
Let me just make here a parenthesis. It is very important, just related what you were saying, because especially musicians, because in this PDCA, as it was clear, we have artists from all areas, which is, so we have 15 every year coming to the first year in each edition, people from different areas. And it is typical from musicians more than the others to start with choosing a repertoire. And that kills immediately or makes it very difficult to progress. Instead of beginning with a choice of repertoire, they are stimulated to find or to dig deep on themselves to find a concept or some ethical decision, which will be the issue they will be then exploring and investigating, etc. So, but it's very typical for musicians to start with repertoire instead of starting with a concept or some potential tension that comes from an unconformity and an inquietude, whatever. Sorry, it was just to...
Now we just want to introduce other examples, because in the first part of this webinar, we introduced the 3 projects that are developed. The first one, it was not a musician in particular. The other 2, yes, they were. But in the 3 cases, the artists involved were people with that had somehow, in a way or another, a transdisciplinary practice before they joined the doctoral program. So now these examples you see are students that were well rooted in the conservatoire tradition with the typical classical training, and you see how their projects, in a way or another, were explored through these strategies, through this strategy in particular, the IPAMOP. So the first example is a thesis developed at the University of Aveiro by Letícia Durante, entitled Music and Movement Connecting Performance, Body and Composition, which is currently awaiting its defense date. Leticia's issue, talking in IPAMOP terms, is her perception that the body is neglected in modern flute music performance, a frustration experienced in her own practice and later recognized by other artists and in the literature. By placing this concern in a broader context, the author develops the problematic, identifying this practical gap, the difficulty to have a more developed bodily awareness in the field of music performance, the absence of research conducted by performers on the use of their own bodies as a means of expression, despite relevant references in neuroscience, philosophy, musicology, and the arts. The action in her case takes the form of 4 creations that explore the new expressive layers in flute performance, as well as less hierarchical models of working with the composer through artistic residences and collaborative formats. These actions implement the plan to bridge the identified gap, setting a clear objectives to develop a new body-centered performance practice, to experiment with modes of shared composition, and to rethink the composer-performer relationship. The method, in her case, is based on experimentation and reflection on the creative process themselves. Residences, rehearsals, joint creation of scores, body-mediated performance, video documentation, and reflective writing on the interactions between composer and performer. The project's outputs include the scores and performances resulting from 4 creations, as well as the residencies, presentations, and the exercises that now form part of both the author's performative practice and her pedagogical activity. Finally, the pertinence of the research is evident in its social and educational implications. The project contributes to reconfigure expectations around instrumental concert music, values the body as a producer of knowledge, and proposes pedagogical approaches that move away from a mechanistic view of a technique. So in her case, beyond exploring this in her own artistic practice, this also had a pedagogical implication. The second example, Os Desencantos de Dandara, was developed within a second cycle conservatoire context by a classically trained singer whose education was firmly grounded in Western art music tradition. The project originated in a clear issue, articulated by the student as a practical unease with the conventional song recital. As she writes, the traditional format often constrains expressivity and limits the performer's ability to engage music, text, and performance as unified narrative experience. This concern emerges directly from practice and reflects a lived tension that she lived in that case, rather than a pre-formulated research question. This concern was then developed into a problematic by situating it within existing performance practices. The student observes that, unlike opera, where music, text, characters, and staging coexist, song recitals often rely solely on melody and text, leaving performers to find alternative sources of inspiration to enrich interpretation. Here, an artistic gap becomes visible. The absence of dramaturgical and visual dimensions that could be explored in classical recital culture. The action proposed was to design an alternative recital format integrating extra musical elements. As stated in the dissertation, the project aimed to propose a new approach for the performance of Brazilian songs through the integration of extra musical components, deliberately incorporating visual and performative strategies to support narrative coherence. This marks the moment where dialogue with other artistic fields becomes necessary, not by obligation, but by artistic demand. In terms of method, the project relied on rehearsal-based experimentation, reflective documentation, and a small-scale questionnaire designed to explore the project's pertinence. These methods were not used to generate abstract theory, but to support reflection within practice, allowing decisions to emerge iteratively through doing. The resulting output was a reconfigured recital format, Os Desencantos de Dandara, which expanded the boundaries of traditional song performance. Its pertinence was articulated in relation to a broad cultural concerns, particularly the need to engage contemporary audiences more meaningfully, echoing the author's reference to declining classical music audiences and the importance of activating the listener's imagination. Crucially, the project's transdisciplinary character did not stem from an intention to combine disciplines, but from the internal logic of the inquiry itself. Engagement with theatrical, visual, and narrative practices emerged because they became essential to address the artist's central concern. This example demonstrates how, when research is centered on artists' own challenges, as proposed by APAMOP, transdisciplinary arises organically as a response to artistic necessity, even within highly traditional conservatoire contexts. The last example, the project Mysticism in Musical Performance, developed in the second cycle conservatoire program by a classically trained flutist, and explores mysticism as experiential and interpretative dimension of contemporary music. It arises from a practice-based concern with the limits of conventional instrumental interpretation and the wish to extend musical meaning beyond what is written in the score, particularly in works by Mario Lavista and Toru Takemitsu, whose compositions are deeply informed by mystical thought. In response, the project proposes an interpretative strategy that combines specialized flute performance with other means of sound production, including ancestral instruments such as gongs, crystal bowls, conch shell, those instruments that are typically used in sound healing, that are also used to create meditative sound environments. The research unfolds through practice-based experimentation, collaboration within the ensemble Siderai Nunciai, and reflective documentation of rehearsals and performances, culminating in a staged recital understood as a situated manifestation of inquiry, rather than a fixed work. The project transdisciplinary character stems not from an external decision to mix disciplines, but from the internal demands of the artistic question, which require dialogue with ritual practices, therapeutic sound traditions, and improvisation. In this way, it shows how the IPMOP framework can support transdisciplinary artistic research in the conservatoire context by grounding also the process in the performance on challenges and allowing other artistic and epistemic domains to emerge from practice. These examples invite us to reflect more broadly on what it means to teach artistic research in conservatoire settings today. If transdisciplinary thinking can be cultivated through practice-based inquiry, even among students with little prior exposure to cross-artistic dialogue, then Challenger is no longer one of possibility, but of pedagogical design and institutional conditions. As a final note, it's important to acknowledge that this process has not been without difficulties. Working transdisciplinarily within artistic research often generates tensions, particularly in dialogue with other disciplines that operate according to different epistemic assumptions, timelines, or evaluative frameworks. Moreover, the supervisory approach we have described requires time, continuity, and a deep relational engagement. It demands that teachers and supervisors cultivate spaces of trust in which students feel sufficiently secure to explore their subjectivity, their doubts, and their vulnerabilities as part of the research process. Such depth of engagement cannot be accelerated, nor can it be reduced to technical supervision alone. At the same time, we strongly believe that repositioning learning around students' desired artistic outcomes can make a decisive difference in fostering learning that's both meaningful and professionally situated. When educational processes are oriented towards what students aspire to become and to realize artistically, research, reflection, and transdisciplinary dialogue gain coherence and purpose. Learning is no longer experienced as an external requirement, but as an integral part of artistic development and professional identity formation. Looking ahead, one of our next steps is to conduct a qualitative study examining the implications of this approach for students' long-term learning trajectories, with particular attention to how research-centered and transdisciplinary pedagogies shape artistic thinking over time. For those interested in following this work further, what we did so far, a volume to be published by Routledge in 2026 will include a dedicated chapter on the PDCA and the IPMOP supervisory strategy, offering a more detailed account of its conceptual foundations, pedagogical implementation, and ongoing developments. It's all from our end, so thank you very much for your attention.
But we still have some time left, and I would really love to use some minutes still to have or continue a discussion, or maybe there are questions in the audience which might be addressed immediately. Your very inspiring presentation, and me personally, I think what Gilvano, what you were talking about at the end, seems to me to be crucial, because you're touching a little bit upon the point that how to bring the student in the situation to be from the beginning of his studies a researcher, so to say, regardless what settings there are. And I just immediately came up to my mind, if you talk about about interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, this seemed to me, the idea came up that you could even talk about historically about a pre-disciplinary setting, because the original idea of an universitas in the even medieval sense was just to go there and to put the learner in the situation of being a researcher. And that's exactly what that resonates a little bit to me, the fact that if you have, and as you said, Jorge, not looking for a repertoire, but for a question you have, and for an ambition you have, and for what do you want to learn. So it's I understood it as an appeal for student-centered learning from the very beginning, and to build a framework which enables or empowers students to really be student-centered. And I think your input was really contributing a lot by opening up many boxes where you could find maybe little tiny mosaic pieces that in the end the student has to put together himself or herself. So in that sense, that's just my very personal reflection on it. But I would just give the floor to the audience. If you have any comments, questions, make use of it. We still have a little bit of time left, and these wonderful people are still here.
Thank you, Stefan. We are happy to listen from you and answer as soon as we can.
Thank you, Gilvano and Jorge, very much for a really interesting webinar. I wanted just to go back to one of your final points, Gilvano, which is to do with the trust that's required between supervisors with students, creating that environment of trust. And I recognize from my own experience that I've had experiences where that trust has developed in a rich and deep way, and the extraordinary fertility of relationships where that is the case. But at the same time, I've seen and observed situations where personal and professional and disciplinary trust seems to break down or be much less robust, and the problems are revisited on the student as a result. You talked about the tendency for people perhaps to promote their own discipline or promote their own view. But I wondered whether you had any reflections on what might be the factors that cultivate trust. What can we do to try to support the building of trust between supervisors, between disciplines?
Well, this is a wonderful question, Stefan. Thank you very much. Well, I can share a little bit about our experience dealing with these topics. One thing that we realized, and it was clear since the beginning of the doctoral program in artistic creation, that when students have a room to share more about their subjectivities, their tensions, their concerns, this create a common space of trust, not only among them as students, but also with the teachers involved, if the teachers embrace that. Because we realized with the first cohort of students that sometimes, well, they were confronted with different situations. I mean, in terms of lectures, assessment, and so on. And sometimes the focus was in the technical and institutional procedures. And that is right. That is a requirement we have to follow, and it's absolutely fine with that. But they easily feel that their voice is not valued or not heard, So one of the preoccupations we have, I think Jorge can say the same, is to create a kind of rapport with the students since the beginning of the course, in order to create a mechanism of communication where he feels that they can say what he or she wants to say. Because in order to approach all these things we are approaching here, there is another concept we didn't mention, but is crucial in this process. And this concept is empathy. So if we are advocating an empathy through arts, we should also exercise empathy in the supervisory process. This, I think, is one of the most difficult issues when we are dealing with people. When we are alone with the students, at least this is what we experience, it's perhaps easy to manage all these things. But when you have to conjugate different interests in a research team, it becomes more difficult. But even in these cases, I think that exercising this empathy and being aware that the first thing is perhaps to create a kind of rapport would be essential for the process have success at the end. At least is my thinking.
Let me just add that we talked about that in the mainly in the first semester we have all these students who are artists from different areas, and we do weekly we prescribe or promote them to do exercises where they have to dig deep in their subjectivity, exposing. We have several exercises, each one aiming different issues, but it was about the third or fourth session. We had this last edition a kind of transformation in the whole group, because they were presented with so much open presentations about the struggles, the inner struggles of each of the students, and that generated such a complicity between all of them that this issue or this question you are raising about complicity and about creating this connection of trust it was like exploded in that in the good sense in that session. So when they are asked to go deep in their subjectivity, expressing artistically with different means. We are talking about small presentations, 5 minutes, about subject which has to do with this digging in their subjectivity, and they are exposing their feelings that creates connections very deep. And also, of course, this theme of the empathy, they are expressing and they are creating empathy, and they are learning that in art, that's what we are. It is our ethical choice that art has to communicate through sensorial means, and so it's not about conceptual constructions, but about sensory and bodily connection. And so that's a kind of training that brings together this as an effect the trust. It begins with the cultivating of a culture of empathy, and then comes trust altogether.
First of all, many thanks, of course, to Gilvano and Jorge for this really inspiring presentations and webinar. Many thanks also to the facilitator of the breakout groups, to Nina, Stephen, and Finn, and of course, once again, to Gilvano and Jorge. Let me thank you also to Bea from the AEC office for the great support to make this webinar happen, and many thanks to all of you attending.
Thank you, Stefan, for all this effort to promote artistic research teaching. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon, everyone. Bye. Take care.